Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our worship service, those here in person and also online. We're going to start with a scripture reading from Hebrews chapter 11. We're going to read verses 32 to 34. So Hebrews chapter 11, verses 32 to 34. And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. So this is my last sermon for 3 weeks, I think. We're going to be leaving town for a couple of weeks. And then Ben Bailey's coming in the third week, and he's going to speak during that Sunday and that weekend as well. So everybody's invited to that. It's going to be an exciting weekend overall. We are going to Colorado for a couple of weeks. You'll never guess why. It's another bike race, as usual. So I'm doing something called the Colorado Trail Race. So it's a 850-kilometer race in the backcountry of Colorado. So you start in a town called Durango and you end up in Denver. It's known for its rugged terrain, challenging riding, a lot of just hike-a-bikes. You push your bike up the mountain and then ride down the other side kind of thing. Do that over and over again. So it's going to be one of those challenging races, mentally challenging and physically challenging as well. And one thing that's going to help me get through it is knowing that Kristen, Evan, and Joyce, all of us are going on this trip together. They're going to be there at the finish line when I'm done. The ending of these races sometimes are kind of anticlimactic, where you just finish and there's like nobody there, and you got to figure out where to go afterwards. So it'd be nice to know that they're going to be there, and I can trust that they're going to be there. I have faith that they're going to be there at the end. They'll have a nice snack for me and probably a drink, after I'm finished this thing. And if I had doubts that they were going to be there, if I didn't know that they were going to actually show up, it'd be more difficult to finish. It's something I can really focus on while I'm going through this race, and knowing that there's going to be somebody there to pick me up and give me a nice snack at the end. And it helps me finish and overcome, knowing that they're there to support me, at the end and also throughout the race. I'll be making phone calls as time goes on during the race. So it's something that really helps overcome those challenges that I am going to face while on this trail, the times where it's difficult. And these races, and really in life, these races are very similar to real life in a sense, where a lot of the overcoming of obstacles is not necessarily physical, it's a mental thing. It's something that if you have the resolve and the focus to get through whatever difficult obstacle is put in front of you, you can do it. You can get through those things if you have that mental fortitude to get through those cases. And with faith in God, we can overcome the challenges that we have in this world. We know God is going to come through for us. We can focus on Him as a support for us through those difficult times. And He's going to be there at the end as well. When we're finished the race of this life, He's going to be there to support us at the end also. And knowing this, and knowing that we can trust Him, and knowing that He's there for strength and for support, we can stay strong during the challenges of life. Those things that we're going to run into in our lives. Life's not easy. There's a lot of things that we're going to run into that are challenging. And knowing that God's there behind us as our strength and our hope and our anchor, we can get through those things. We can push through those things. And it all starts with a strong faith in God. That faith can overcome the world because of that. If you go to Hebrews 10 and verse 39, we just read verses 32 to 34. We're going to see in this passage the kind of faith that leads to being saved by God. Hebrews 10 and verse 39. But we do not belong to those who shrink back and are destroyed, but to those who have faith and are saved. There is a faith that leads to being saved by God. The last few lessons that we've looked at is dealing with faith. As we go through chapter 11, it's that Faith Hall of Fame is one of the nicknames for this whole chapter, talking about the different examples in the Old Testament of those people that had that great faith. And we saw in the first part of it, we saw the definition of the faith that does please God. It's a faith that has confidence and conviction in things hoped for and in things that are not yet seen. It's a faith that believes God exists, or believe that God exists, and that He's going to reward those who seek Him. And it's a faith that worships like Abel, walks like Enoch, and works like Noah. Those are some of those examples in the Old Testament that we saw. The last lesson, we saw the faith that embraces the promises. In a lot of Old Testament examples, Abraham, Sarah, these examples in the Old Testament of people who put their faith in God, they embraced the promises that he made to them, and they were able to come through and get through those circumstances that they were through. They saw and developed that trust in God through him coming through on his promises. And we can learn from those examples as well, and also put our faith in him and knowing that he's going to come through in the promises he makes to us. Now we're going to come into a passage that talks about the faith that overcomes the world. Keep your bookmark in Hebrews 11. Let's go to 1 John chapter 5. This is another passage that talks about the very same thing. It's a very good passage that describes this faith that does overcome the world. 1 John chapter 5, we'll read verses 3 to 5. So 1 John chapter 5, starting in verse 3. In fact, this is love for God, to keep his commandments. And his commandments are not burdensome. For everyone born of God overcomes the world. This is the victory that has overcome the world, even our faith. Who is it that overcomes the world? The one who believes that Jesus is the Son of God. I love in this passage that it repeats, as it's repeated throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament, that whole concept of faith and obedience. I know in our Wednesday night class, when we're looking at the book of Revelation, the teacher of that class as well, it keeps stressing that over and over again. We have faith and we have obedience. They go hand in hand. You can't have simple belief and no obedience in your life. You can't just have empty obedience with no belief behind it. You have to have that belief as the motivation. We love God, so we are obedient. The obedience isn't saving us. God is still saving us, but he does require us to be obedient to the best of our ability. And that's throughout the New Testament, that concept of having that belief in him and also that belief being reflected in our actions. And we also see that in these examples of the Old Testament characters throughout the Old Testament in the chapter 11 of Hebrews. We go back to Hebrews 11. The last half of chapter 11, we're reminded of how in the Old Testament those who have faith were able to overcome the world. Lots of obstacles that they faced, and they were able to overcome those things. And we can look at that example and apply it to our lives and see how we can also overcome the obstacles that we face because of our faith. If we look at it, Hebrews 11, we'll look at verse 23, and we'll start with some examples of faith in the generation of the Exodus. In the Old Testament history, said before, this book of Hebrews was written to the immediate audience of Jewish Christians, people who were very familiar with these Old Testament examples. And so the writer of the book of Hebrews was referring back to the Old Testament because everybody was familiar with that. We have the benefit of having this collected Bible, very convenient to have. And so we also can be very familiar with these Old Testament examples as well. We stress the New Testament because that's the new covenant. That's the thing to follow. I would also encourage you to read the Old Testament. Get back in there and read through these examples. It's a very encouraging thing and very interesting books to read, especially if you like history. The way things went down back there in the past. It's very interesting to read. That's what the writer of Hebrews in chapter 11 is going back to, is these examples from the Old Testament. And in this passage, it's that generation of the Exodus, when the Israelites were coming out of the land of Egypt, on their way to the Promised Land. They were in Egypt under captivity, and they were coming out of that time. These examples in Hebrews 11 right now, we're going to start in verse 23, is during that generation. We're going to start with the faith of Moses' parents. So Hebrews 11:23. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born, because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. So let's go back to the book of Exodus. Again, keep your bookmark in Hebrews 11. Go to Exodus chapter 2. We're going to read the first 3 verses. This is the account of Moses being born and what Moses' parents did with him. Exodus chapter 2, verses 1 to 3. Now a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. So the mother of Moses saw that he was a fine child. My version says fine child. If you have an older version or a different version, it might say goodly child. That's probably a goodly is a word we don't use very often anymore, so they translated it to fine child in some of the newer translations. But she saw that he was not an ordinary child, somebody who stood out. And so she went against the edict of Pharaoh. If you go back one chapter to verse 22 of chapter 1. So chapter 1 and verse 22 of Exodus. This is what was happening at that time and the reason she had to hide him. So Exodus 1 verse 22. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people. Every Hebrew boy that is born to you, you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. So the Pharaoh is trying to weaken the Israelite people, so he put out this edict to kill all the male children. And Moses' parents were not afraid of that edict. That would have been something hard to go against. That's the government that they were under at the time. That was the rule that they put out at the time. And they're going against that. They're saying, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to go against what this Pharaoh is teaching. And they did that because they had faith in God. Their faith, their belief that everything would work out for the best, gave them courage to withstand the king's edict. And with such a small beginning, by their faith, they overcame the world of Egypt. Egypt was a force that was against them at that time, and they overcame them. And they really started that whole line of the exodus of the Israelite people. It started with Moses surviving this edict at the time. And then as we read on in Hebrews 11, we'll see the faith of Moses as he grew. We go back to Hebrews 11. We'll look at verses 24 to 28. Hebrews chapter 11, starting in verse 24. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God, rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the application of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. So this short passage in the book of Hebrews is actually covering a lot of Israelite history, all in this one big chunk. Moses was saved by his parents by putting him in the Nile. If you carry on with that account, the daughter of Pharaoh found Moses and raised him. As he was raised as the son of Pharaoh. So he raised in this position of political power at the time. So that's where in this passage where he's talking about he chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter and be associated with the Israelite people. So he essentially gave up the position of power under the Egyptian government and chose to be treated badly with the Israelite people. So he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, and he chose that affliction with God's people, with the Hebrew people, rather than enjoy those sins' temporary pleasures. It's kind of going from being treated really well, having anything you want to eat, anything you want to stay, lots of power, to being a slave and somebody who's mistreated and whipped and beaten and put under slave labor. He regarded this disgrace for the sake of Christ more valuable than the treasures of Egypt. So through his faith, he looked ahead to the reward. So he had confidence in those things hoped for. He's looking ahead to the heavenly reward. He's looking ahead to what God is going to give him rather than what he could get immediately from Pharaoh and the Egyptian government at the time. So he left Egypt. Again, this is covering a lot of history at the time. So he was mistreated with the Israelites, and then he left. God told him to leave. So he left not because he was scared of the king, the Pharaoh. He was obeying God. He revered God. He essentially had that fear in God instead of Pharaoh. He knew that God was the one to follow, the one to respect. So through his faith, he persevered through him leaving Egypt. And then he had that conviction in things unseen. Again, he wasn't sure what was going to happen in the future, but he trusted in God that things were going to work out for him in the best and for the Israelite people as the best. So then we skip ahead. It goes into verse 28. By faith he kept the Passover and the application of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. So Moses went to a faraway land, to Midian. Then he came back to Egypt under God's command. And that's where we have the plagues of Egypt. That's where we have Moses talking to Pharaoh saying, let my people go. Pharaoh saying, yeah, I'll do it, and then changing his mind right after, doing all these little plagues that we're going through, or big plagues, I guess. And we get to the final plague where it's the death of the firstborn. And this is the passage that's talking about how Moses was saying to the people, okay, you have to sprinkle the blood of the lamb on the lintels and doorposts. That was what the Israelite people were required to do. And if they did that, then their firstborn would be protected. Otherwise, God was going to kill the firstborn of everybody who didn't have this blood on the lintels and doorposts. So he believed God's warning. Moses had faith in God's warning. He knew this was going to happen. And he understood that it was going to happen, so he had Israel sprinkle the blood on their lintels and doorposts. So by faith, Moses overcame this Egyptian bondage at the time. He led his people out of the country of Egypt. He released, through God's help and through God's power, the Israelite people from Egypt. And he did this all through his faith. He overcame amazing odds because of this. He overcame amazing odds because of his faith. Back in Hebrews 11, we'll keep reading and we'll see the faith of the nation of Israel as an example. This is the whole of the Israelite people at the time. And again, we're going through that history of the time of the Exodus of the Israelite people from Egypt. We look at verse 29 to 30. So Hebrews chapter 11, 29 to 30. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land. But when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the army had marched around them for 7 days. So again, we have two examples here in history, of Israelite history. The first one is when the Israelite people were running from the Egyptians. So Pharaoh said, okay, you guys can go after the death of the firstborn. He said, okay, you guys can go. So the Israelite people left and started walking away. But then again, Pharaoh changed his mind. He says, no, we're going to get those people back. So he started chasing them with an army. So the Israelite people are running away. The Egyptian army is chasing them. They come to the Red Sea, this massive body of water. And if we go to Exodus 14, we'll see what happens at this time. So again, keep your bookmark in Hebrews 11, but go to Exodus chapter 14. Look at a few passages in there. We'll start in verse 21. So Exodus 14 and verse 21. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. And all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided. And the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. So the Israelite people are running from the Egyptians. They come up to this big body of water, the Red Sea. And Moses stretched his hand out over the sea, and through the power of God, the sea was broken apart. It was split. So we had dry land on the ground. So a miraculous thing happened. If you go to verse 27, the Israelite people walk across on dry land, and the Egyptians who followed them, this is what happens to them. So Exodus 14 and verse 27. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back into its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. So that's the fate of the Egyptian army. They went into the dry land that had the walls of water on either side, but then as Moses stretched out his hand over the sea went back into its place. So they were all drowned. They were swept away from the ocean. So the nation of Israel, as we see in this account, they overcame Egypt by walking out between these two walls of water. If you imagine kind of putting yourself in their shoes, you walk up to this big ocean, this big sea, and overnight, all of a sudden, it splits, and you have dry ground. You have two big walls of water on either side. Would you want to walk out between those things? And it's a pretty long walk. It's not like a little short stream. It's like it's hard to see the other end. You have to walk along this whole cavern of water on either side of you. It would take a lot of faith. It would take a lot of belief to understand that, I'm going to be okay. When you're all the way out in the middle of this thing and you see nothing but water behind you and in front of you in this dry ground, to just know that you can go on and trusting that God is going to keep you safe during this whole thing. So the nation of Israel overcame Egypt by walking out into these two walls of water on dry ground. It really took a lot of faith for them to do that, and they overcame the army of Egypt because of their faith. We go back to Hebrews 11, and we look at verse 30. This is another account from Israelite history. where the Israelite nation destroyed the city of Jericho. So verse 30, it says, "By faith the walls of Jericho fell, after the army had marched around them for 7 days." Again, large passage in the book of Joshua, if you were to look in the Old Testament account, about this account of the Israelite nation coming up to the city of Jericho and how they conquered it. 13 times they encircled the city, and they showed their faith in God rather than their own military might. Typically, when an army was going to go up against a city, they would siege it. They would just make sure that nobody could come in and out and essentially starve out the people that are in the city. The Israelite people were doing something that was strange with respect to military tactics, of just walking around a city, 7 days in a row and just doing this over and over again. But at the end of this, the walls fell when they gave that last shout and blow of the trumpets. They were following what they were told to do, saying, walk around 7 times and then shout and blow your trumpets. And God had the walls fall of Jericho. The walls fell down and they were able to go in and invade and capture the city. This took faith as well. Again, it'd be kind of strange. You're not following what is typically done as far as military tactics go. They're walking around the city just kind of shouting and blowing trumpets. Like, what good is that going to do? But they knew that that was what God required of them. That was the obedience that was required of them. So they had their faith and they had their obedience, and God had them delivered the city to them through his power. So by faith, Israel overcame Egypt in the first account and also Jericho in the second account. Go back to Hebrews 11 and verse 31. We're going to look at an example from the Old Testament history who is not an Israelite. Hebrews 11 verse 31. "By faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient." So let's go to Joshua chapter 2. Let's look at this account in the Old Testament. This is where the Israelite nation was going to attack a city, and Rahab was one who helped the spies that were looking into the city and seeing what was going on. So Joshua 2, verses 8 to 11 is what we'll look at. So Joshua 2, starting in verse 8. "Before the spies lay down for the night, she went up on the roof and said to them, 'I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the 2 kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, who you completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is in heaven above and on the earth below.'" So this is an example of showing how faith is based on proof. Faith isn't just a leap in the dark. We can see that Rahab had faith because of what she knew. She saw that God fulfilled his promises. She saw that God did what he was going to do in keeping the Israelite people safe. She understood this, and she realized this, and so she has faith in God that he's going to overcome her city as well. So she acted on her faith, and she hid the Israelite spies. She saved them. And she didn't perish when the city was invaded. When they came up to Jericho, because that's where she was, the city was invaded, but she was kept safe. She was kept safe through this whole thing. So she overcame the world of sin and unbelief because of what she knew about God through the faith that she developed through what she learned and the evidence that was presented to her. So through faith, Israel received the promised land as it was promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And in the process, they overcame the obstacles the world placed in front of them. We saw how Moses did the same thing, and we also saw how the parents of Moses did the same thing. The Israelite people did this. They all overcame the obstacles presented in front of them. And even a Gentile sinner like Rahab had faith, and she was able to overcome as well in her situation. As we continue in the book of Hebrews, if you look at Hebrews 11, we're going to have a bit of a summary in this passage. So verses 32 to 40. We're going to see a bunch of different examples. The ones we looked at earlier are specific examples. This is more of a general description, a general list of other examples. Again, this is where it's really valuable to read the Old Testament, because when you read passages like this, you can recognize what's being referred to here. We're going to do a quick kind of run through of this stuff. But if you really want to know what some of these people went through in the Old Testament, read the Old Testament, really see what these examples are all about, because it's very encouraging and it helps build our faith as well. Look at verse 32 of Hebrews chapter 11. And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, and about David and Samuel and the prophets. So the author chose not to describe the faith of others in detail. Again, the immediate audience is Jewish Christians, so they're going to be familiar with these names. And again, I think it's our responsibility to be familiar with them as well. As you live your Christian life, study the Old Testament so these things are familiar to you. And he talks about judges like Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, the king of David, a prophet like Samuel, and the other prophets also in the Old Testament. He doesn't describe in detail exactly what they went through, similar to Rahab and Abraham or Moses and Moses' parents in the nation of Israel. But he does provide a list of things that they did go through. We keep reading on, Hebrews 11, 33 to 37. This is a summary list of what faith had accomplished and has accomplished in the Old Testament. Hebrews 11, starting verse 33. So who, through faith, conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gave what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released, so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. So a big summary list of what these people with faith overcame. And these are things that are pretty extreme. A lot of these things listed in here are pretty severe persecutions that we can read about. They conquered kingdoms. In the Old Testament, you can see how Joshua conquered Palestine and Jericho. We see David conquering neighboring nations. There's lots of examples about the Israelite people conquering the nations around them when they put their faith in God. There's a lot of other examples in the Old Testament about where they put their faith in themselves and said that, yeah, we as people can conquer this nation, but we're going to do it without God's help, and then they fail. But whenever they put their faith in God, they overcame. They administered justice. Your version might say worked righteousness. That's in verse 33. So people in the Old Testament administered justice. Samuel is a judge. David is a king. Solomon is a king. They all administered God's justice, what God wanted them to do. They also gained what was promised. Your version might say obtained promises. So as we read through the Old Testament, we can see the nation of Israel did receive the promised land, just as God promised way back in the time of Abraham, saying your offspring is going to be like the sand of the seashore, and I'm going to give you a land. And that did happen. They received what was promised. They shut the mouths of lions. You might think immediately to Daniel in the lion's den, and that applies for sure, the account of that. We also have Samson. When a young lion came to attack him, he overcame the lion because of his faith in God. David protecting his sheep. He overcame these predators against his sheep through his faith in God. They quenched the fury of the flames. There's an example in Daniel of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the fiery furnace. How they had their faith in God and they actually willingly crawled into this fiery furnace that was burning super hot and overcame because of their faith in God. They escaped the edge of the sword. There's the account of David fleeing King Saul. And Saul was trying to kill him, and through his faith in God, David overcame. He was able to escape Saul trying to kill him. Jezebel was trying to get Elijah the prophet. We could see the account there. The king of Israel wanted to murder Elisha, the prophet, as well. There's an account of somebody who escaped the edge of the sword, all through their faith in God. Their weakness was turned to strength. In the Old Testament, you can see many examples of this as well. One that stands out is Samson becoming strong again. His hair was cut, so his strength went away. But then right at the end of his life, he got that strength from God again. He had that belief and faith in God and was able to overcome those who were persecuting him. They became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Like mentioned before, Israel, when they put their faith in God, they were able to rout those foreign armies. Individually, we have the account of David defeating Goliath. He put his faith in God, little guy against a really, really big guy, and still was able to defeat him because of his faith in God. I like that whole account because everybody in the Israelite army was too scared to go up against Goliath because he's this big, huge guy. But David, this little guy, says, come on, put your faith in God. We can take care of anybody. And so he did, and God was behind him, and he was able to overcome in that situation. Again, many other examples of Israel, the Israelite nation, the Judah nation, or the nation of Judah, winning in battle when they put their faith in God. When they tried to put their faith in themselves, they weren't able to overcome. But when they had their faith in God, they were. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. Again, examples in the Old Testament. One that stands out is the Shunammite woman through Elisha. Her son passed away, but Elisha was there, and through the power of God, he was raised to life again. We look back and we read verses 35, starting verse 35 again, Hebrews 11. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning, they were sawn in two, they were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. So again, many examples in the Old Testament of those who were faithful in God, and they were persecuted and mistreated. These are a lot of examples. Again, you can go back in the Old Testament and see where these specific items, put to death by stoning, you can see where that applies in the Old Testament as well if you study through the Old Testament. But there are examples of people who are faithful in God, and they're persecuted. They're mistreated because of their faith and because of their obedience to God. But they still endured these things so that they might gain an even better resurrection. They knew where to put their faith, just like Moses did when he was willing to go be mistreated with the Israelite people because he put his faith in God. The treasures in heaven were his focus. Read verses 38 to 40 of Hebrews chapter 11. We can see in this passage what these people received because of the faith that they had. Hebrews 11, verses 38 to 40. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us they would be made perfect. They had their faith, and they endured these things not because of the praise of the world, but because of what God had promised to them. Many had to wander in deserts and mountains, live in dens and caves. Elijah is one example of that. You can see many examples of that in the Old Testament as well. They went through a lot. They went through a lot of persecution, a lot of hard times. But really, truthfully, the world is not worthy of them. They were mistreated, but they still had that faith in God, and they were going to obtain that better promise. They didn't obtain the promise during their lifetime. Some of them did receive the promises. There were promises that were made at that time during those points in history. One big example is that promised land, about how God promised the Israelite nation the promised land. They did receive that. But the reference in this passage is really referring to the promise of spending eternity with God in heaven. They predicted, these Old Testament prophets predicted the Messiah, the coming of the Messiah, and they saw that he was going to come. They knew that he was going to come. They wrote the words down in the Old Testament so that they could predict that the Messiah was going to come. But they didn't experience this perfection that Christ offers. It didn't happen during their lifetime. We saw in other passages in the book of Hebrews about how the Old Testament law could not make them perfect. It could not make them complete so they could have that perfect relationship with God. But Christ can give us that and did give them that. What they did not receive during their lifetime, they did receive with the coming of Christ. Christ died to redeem them as well as us. All of us are getting those benefits, that promise of spending eternity in heaven with God and with Christ. They are now made perfect just as we are. We can accept the gift that's presented to us under the new covenant, and we can have that perfect relationship with God through the sacrifice of Jesus and him interceding for us in heaven. They can now experience that same thing as well with the coming of Christ. So through faith, these examples from the Old Testament really show how their faith overcame the world, overcame those obstacles that they were faced with at that time. And sometimes their victory was miraculous, sometimes it was not. Sometimes they died in faith. They were persecuted. They were martyrs because of the faith that they had. But now, with the coming of Christ, they enjoy the fruit of their faith. They have that eternity with heaven, or eternity in heaven with the Father. And through faith, we can also overcome the world. Faith in Jesus as the Son is going to give us victory. We're going to have that gift. We're going to have victory over the world's temptations. We're going to have victory over the world's persecutions, whatever we might be going through our times that we live. The victories we win might not be as grandiose as we see in the Old Testament, nations fighting nations. But those little victories that we get over, those little obstacles that we can face and overcome through our faith in God, is going to help us. And we can do that through our faith in Christ and through the strength that he provides to us. And if we're faithful until death, just like the prophets, our reward is going to be the same as the prophets. We're going to experience eternity in heaven with God and with Christ. So with this chapter of the heroes of faith, this Hall of Fame of faith, it serves to motivate us to grow in our faith as well, to be like them, to imitate the things that they've done in their life, to really base our lives on the belief that God is going to come through for us and the promises that he presents to us. And it's a faith that pleases God, that embraces the promises, and that does overcome the world. We may not win the praise of the world because of our faith, but we will receive the praise of God. And this is the faith that leads to our salvation. This leads to our spending eternity in heaven with Jesus and with Christ. So I'd like to offer that invitation. If you've not yet accepted this gift, it's presented to everybody in the world. We could show you in the scripture how to do this. Again, you have to have that belief and you have to have that obedience as well to please God. We can show you in the scriptures how to be obedient, how to accept this gift that's offered to everybody in the world. And if you are struggling in any way, again, please make your needs known. We'd love to help in any way that we can.